Well, good afternoon, my friends. It's afternoon on the East Coast, but it's the morning on the West Coast. And today I'm very excited to bring you a conversation with my new friend, Jessica Maria Ross, who is a public media journalist and has lived many lives. And she's just launching a brand new resource, which is so robust and so interesting. It's called Taking Care, a guide for participatory and trauma-informed journalism. Um, and today, I'm having my ice cold decaf instead of tea, and we'll see if she's having tea with me. Jessica, knock, knock, knock. Are you there?
I am here. Hello.
Hello. So glad to have you here. What's it
Thank
like on
you.
the West Coast today?
It is hot. We are on day one of a week-long heat wave here in the Central Valley of California. I'm in the Sacramento area, the state capital, and it is forecast to be about 110 degrees. So I have my iced coffee, and it's also only 10 in the morning here on the West Coast. So I'm jamming with you with some iced coffee.
Oh my gosh, I thought we were having a heat wave and we've been whining about it, like hitting 100 the other day. I can't even, like, we would lose our ever-loving minds if we saw 110 here.
Yeah, well, it's different everywhere. I mean, you all have the wet heat, I think, and we have the dry heat. And I think for myself, I would pick dry heat, the wet heat and the humidity. I'm like a fading flower in that situation, whereas dry heat, since I grew up with it, um, I can manage it.
Yeah. And so for me, I've learned that the way to manage it within my house is that I have my morning, place where I can be in the house and I have my afternoon place where, I kind of have to move around for different levels of comfort. Is that one of the ways that you manage?
Well, we're really fortunate where I live, which is a university town called Davis, and we get what's called the Delta breeze off of the big delta that comes up from the San Francisco Bay Area. And so usually how we deal with it is we just open up all our doors and windows in the evening and the whole place cools down. And in the morning, you just shut everything. It's like old school grandparent technique, right? And then our house happens to stay cool most of the day. We spend a lot of time insulating it, planting trees. So we just have one story. There's not a whole lot of places we can go between my office here and the rest of the house. So fortunately, we can just cool it down at night and be thankful for the trees that people planted way back and the trees that we have planted to keep us cool.
Mm, Gotcha. Well, I'm so excited to get to know you better. We've been talking a little bit to set up this conversation, of course, but
Yeah.
let's start. Let's go all the way back to the beginning. As Maria von Trapp says, the beginning is a very good place to start.
Should I break into the sound of music?
Oh, here's our Lord. Where were you born? Where did you grow up?
Ah, well, I was actually born here in the Central Valley of California in Stockton. My joke is that I was uh, my parents became pregnant when they were living in London, and then I was gestated in northern Italy, where my mother's people are from, and then flown back to Stockton. So my label would be London, London, Milan, Stockton. I was born in Stockton, California, and I was raised mostly in Southern California, in Los Angeles and Northern San Diego County. And I feel like I've always had a foot in both worlds. Northern California is quite different than Southern California, but my mother's family are all farmers. And so I spent a lot of time on all vacations and summers up on the farm, and then grew up more on the coast and the beach in Southern California. And then I came up to Northern California to go to school here in Davis, the town where I live. Was fortunate enough to get a home when homes were like cheap. It was made sense to buy a home because it wasn't that much more than your rent. Like that was a long time ago, clearly. And I've been based here in Northern California ever since.
It's so wild. The immediate previous conversation to this one that I had on Tea and Jam was with a guy who also grew up on a farm. So it must be something about tilling the ground and, sowing those seeds that I need to pay attention to with the conversation that I'm having. Um, so how do you feel like that early life sort of led into the work that you do today? Like what seeds were sown in that
Mm. Well, I would say that I'd say a couple of things. My grandparents were immigrants from Italy. Their first language was Piemontese, and they were able to get a farm before the Dust Bowl, so they experienced being able to get land, but then seeing people dispossessed from land, and they welcomed and allowed what were called Okies to camp on the river. Our farm was on the Stanislaus River. Um, and I think I learned a lot from my grandparents on that side about working the land, hard work, caring for other people that also had to leave their homes, um, not putting yourself above other people, sharing your harvest and your produce. I mean, all of the family would always be giving everybody what came from their farm. And 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 preparing, there was a lot of always canning and putting up everything, and they were on a farm, so it's not like they would run into town for anything, so they would have everything available. So I feel like I learned that from my grandparents on my Italian side. I also have Jewish grandparents, and I feel like I learned from them. um uh, I think I learned from them a lot around um, protecting yourself, and and some of the messages on that side were a little more about the importance of family, but also like not being public with your identity, keeping that to yourself, keeping things ready keeping your to-go bag always ready. Um, And I guess the piece I would tell you that most affected me, Shannon, is that my mom died when I was 5. And the way in which my family at the time, this was when hospitals did not let kids in if they were under 13. So she was just kind of whisked away, and we didn't see her again until right before she died, when she was very, very horrified, scary looking. It's also before, doctors openly talked about death. There weren't social workers, and my family thought the best thing they could do was just take down all of her pictures and never talk about her. And I know they did that as an act of love. But I think the seeds, as you asked, like what seeds were planted, I think a seed that was planted at that time is that, um, that sometimes that folks that have the power sometimes to help you and support you don't know how to do that and don't do it well. And that when things are taboo, you shouldn't talk about them. And that, um, yeah, so I think those seeds, and I think how that bridges over to my life's work is that I think that in my family, I um, felt a need to talk about what happened and to understand what happened and to find out histories and legacies and stories that were kind of rendered invisible, and to find the power within myself, and to speak up and to feel heard and to feel supported in that kind of healing journey and repair. And I think that I have taken that forward into the work I do with community storytelling, kind of creating alternate families that care about each other and listen and support one another in finding out what it is they want and need to talk about, feeling heard in that process, and in that kind of reparative journey where you start feeling your own sense of belonging first in your own skin and then in the circle of support and then in the wider society, you can then take action in the directions that you want to go.
Beautiful. So let's talk a little bit about some worky work before we get to this amazing uh, booky book.
Yeah, let's talk about the work you work.
Yeah. So have you had a wandering journey? Like what steps along the way have led you to creating this publication?
Mm, yeah, because it's really a full circle publication. Um, So I would I've had a bit it has felt like it's been circuitous, my career journey. I think the through line has always been bringing people together in a caring and supporting environment to tell stories we need and want to hear to make changes in our lives. And I really got started in all that as an activist in college. And this was, I mean, I'm older, so this was before cell phones and YouTube. So it was a big deal to like get your story out there. It's kind of hard to get your head around now, but back in the day, getting a camcorder, which I don't even know if they exist anymore, but getting a camcorder and recording and making your own television or getting a audio recorder or making your own radio. I mean, these were really um, powerful acts of self-representation and community problem solving and collaboration. So I got really into that as an activist, mostly because I had bad experiences with journalists. And by bad experiences, I mean, it was hard to get on journalist radar. It was hard. You had to prove that you had something important and newsworthy. If they covered your events or talked to you, it wasn't really necessarily from the angle or frame that you felt reflected you or rang true. And a lot of times it was out of context, your quotes. So I kind of figured out early on in college as an activist that if I wanted to get our stories out in the ways in which I thought they needed to get out, I needed to make my own. So I got into the public access television movement. I got into the community radio movement. I learned to make my own scrappy documentaries and TV programs and radio shows. And I started teaching other people how to make theirs. And I discovered in the process that I have a gift for teaching and supporting other people in both the technology at the time and the storytelling. And I was able to then do that work here in Northern California and then across the country. I've been blessed to work in places as diverse as, Appalachia, New York City, West Sacramento, with all sorts of different constituencies. And then I was able to work overseas, doing a lot of media development work, largely in Africa. But again, always with this same idea of how do we bring people together and figure out stories to tell, learn how to tell them, figure out what medium to tell them in, actually get skills, make using those platforms. And then the piece that I think that has been unique to my process is I've always had a component of public presentation and dialogue. Um, and um, and so, how do I help people figure out how to get in front of a group, what they want to say, build facilitation skills. And always another part of my model is create pathways for next steps. Because a lot of times people get in the room and they get charged up about whatever story it is or whatever hope, dream, or issue folks are tackling in the conversation and making sense out of. But then what? So working with people to always figure out like how to then move that energy in some direction, largely to community partners um, or other initiatives that are already happening in the community.
Yeah. Okay, so hang on, pull over. I there's a couple of things that I want to like jam with you about that are resonating with me from my early experiences as a professional or just a person coming up through the world. One
Yeah.
is You talk about in your new guide about having been connected with the Take Back the Night marches.
Oh,
And that was totally something that I did as a, young person in college. And that just felt so activating. It was like one of my first, training experiences as a young person. And I just was so, it brought back so many memories to have been involved in that work.
yeah.
Where were you when you were doing that? And what do
Oh
you
my
feel
gosh. I'm
for
so
that?
glad you brought that up.
Yeah.
So, that was my first documentary.
Oh, wow.
So here I am in Davis. And to be honest, I created my whole model. I only realized this writing this publication that you talked about called Taking Care, but I realized looking back that my whole model of media making started in that first documentary. And so, for folks who might not know what Take Back the Night is, it's a national movement where groups come together for one night every year and they basically take over the streets to make them safe for largely women, but everybody around safe from violence.
Mhm.
And so, I was here in Davis. I was learning to make, as an activist, learning to make documentaries, or wanting to make documentaries. And a friend invited me to a Take Back the Night meeting. I was instantly activated. It was the first time I was around a lot of women. And again, I am older. I think it's probably really hard for young women these days to imagine this, or young women identified folks to imagine this. But there really was a time within my lifetime, the messages I grew up with, and probably you, are that women are absolutely second class, that we're not as smart, we're not worth as much, we can't do as much, and we should really go for the lower hanging fruit. So to get in a group of, women and women identified folk who are like, no, we are going to kick ass. We are going to make these streets safe for us. We're going to make this world safe for us. We are in this together. Completely gave me the idea, the embodied feeling that we can create communities of care that work together to make the community, to care for everyone in that community. And that's what the Take Back the Night group did for and with me. And my contribution was, I'm going to document this. And because I felt part of the community, and this relates later to what we're going to talk about in journalism, because I identified as part of that community, I didn't have to be a distanced observer. I didn't have to try and be objective. I am part of this community. I'm a woman. I've been assaulted. I want to make the world better for other folks. I'm going to contribute by making a documentary. I was able to come up with these ideas, I'm in my early 20s, of asking them what it is they feel are important issues to convey, how would they want to be seen, who wants to speak, who doesn't want to speak, running quotes by them, all the things that at the time were antithetical and to some degree still are in journalism. But this whole idea of how do you collaborate with people at the center of an issue in using media in telling the story. So that was very activating. And I have lots of memories of just like, it wasn't even a camcorder, it was this big porta pack that you had like, it was like this big. It was heavy and it was
Yeah.
connected to the audio recorder. So you had to have either your audio recorder on you or someone else that you were tethered to. Like, anyway, it was a beautiful experience. And I'm glad to know that you also had an experience around Take Back the Night.
Oh yeah, we were, hosting those rallies in the tiny little liberal arts college in Southwest Virginia that I went to, and then later when I went to Virginia Tech, and then we would go up to DC to, learn to shout and march and stuff. But I also had some early experiences that were very negative with media journalists.
Yeah.
Um,
What happened for you?
Well, just misquotes and,
Yeah.
just that. I mean, I am on more than one occasion referred to journalists as being vultures because of their extractive practices. And I was at Virginia Tech when the shootings happened there. So
Right.
like, really difficult, just that feeling of being under the microscope. And it was stunning to me that by that night, there were Swiss media like in our
Yeah.
faces, shoving their fuzzy faces. Such that it was so bad that, there was a whole field covered in vans, and it got so bad that they had to put signs on the academic building saying media not welcome in here, because they were just like swarming the place. And I started having images of just like punching a media person in the face because that moment for us was so, it was before we had a shooting every day or every other day type.
Hmm.
So, so
Yeah, it was
it,
kind of like a 9/11 moment when it comes to school shootings. It hadn't happened, and for that reason, it caused this media stir. But the other side of that, like you say, is that, when we talk about media, we kind of lump it all together, and there's so many different kinds of media. But I would say that, you know, a lot of media has been about, there's a tricky thing about media reporting, right? There's the one hand of wanting to give people information they need, to keep themselves safe, to make decisions, to, engage in public life. The other side of that is that, we're wired to pay attention to what's basically violent, or sexual, or if it bleeds, it leads. And so there's this thing that a lot of, I think, reporting has done, which is it has a public service mission, but to basically gain audience and retain audience, it tends to focus on, the most sensational. And then, of course, they parachute people in to do that. And that, Shannon, what you're talking about, that's the kind of legacy of harm that a lot of journalistic organizations have created. And we're on the other side of that now, where so many people have then decided to check out of news, not or journalism, not trust it, turn it off. So the trust has been broken, and the repair is in process, but it's going to take a while, and it's a big deal. And not all news outlets and journalism outlets are ready to do it.
yeah. Well, so I've come a long way since then. I've been on a journey of sorts with my own relationship. And now I live in Atlanta, and I know a number of journalists or people who work in media. And that's helped a lot. And then I've also, I've just wrapped up working for 6 years doing this storytelling project for
Right.
the on developmental disabilities. And I think we could really jam for a long time about the nuanced differences between a storytelling project and a journalism project, which I found myself really resonating with some of the care work that you were embedding into the learnings that you were trying to convey in your care guide. Actually, let's get to that. So let's
Sure.
talk about the project that inspired the development and the publication that you are just releasing.
Yeah.
Talk about like where all that came from, and especially I was fascinated with the timing of that, because the project that you describe started just before the pandemic, and
Yeah.
that some of that story it's really unraveled because of the pandemic, which I thought I'm so appreciative of how much you sort of really talked about the like in a very vulnerable and open way some of
Mm,
the good things and the hard things about that work, which is one of the hardest conversations that I have with one of my friends who is an old school journalist who still to this day insists that you cannot put yourself into your work.
yeah. Yeah. Um, well, I understand. I'll just say that I understand the journalists who um are doing investigative reporting around corruption or serious systemic breakdown, um, where they don't want to put themselves in the reporting, right? Like you don't want to co-create with a corrupt official, or you don't want to collaborate with an untrustworthy, partner. So I get that. The kind of journalism that I practice, I would recommend moving towards for a lot of journalists is this kind of care-centered or participatory and trauma-informed, I'll call it, journalism, where you do put yourself in the project. And if you don't, um, let me say it this way. The benefit of putting yourself in the project is that it's a way that you build trust and people understand that you have their interests at heart because you are working with them and reporting with them, not on them or about them. So I guess your question is about this project and how it started. Is that what you wanted
Yeah,
me to?
tell us a little bit of the story, the origin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was working in a public radio newsroom in the capital here in California, and um, the news manager had gotten an email, excuse me, from a sexual assault survivor who basically said that she had had just epically horrible experience with the Sacramento Police Department trying to report her rape and that she really felt she wasn't alone. And if he wanted to know more and talk more and tell that story, she would be open to that. And that kind of opened the door. This was an amazing woman who opened the door to bringing other women in to talk to us about their experiences and over time co-create a project called After the Assault that really looks at what survivors experience in the reporting process and how healing might happen even when there isn't a legal resolution of their case. And we created a podcast and talk shows and a whole digital guide to reporting sexual assault in Sacramento County, a guide to talking with survivors. And I think what's really interesting about the whole project, not just interesting, what's compelling about the project is that um, I was invited in to lead it because of my background in doing participatory journalism, sharing power with people in telling their story. And I was invited to do that because this survivor who initiated the whole project said very clearly to our news director and our healthcare reporter who had gone to talk with her that the only way she would continue or even support the project is that if she used the word agency, if survivors had agency in the telling of their story, um, and could do some and had some control, which is something that survivors absolutely need after having their world disrupted by a violent assault. Um, so I can drill down to details, but maybe I'll just leave it there for now.
Well, so I want to talk about that sense of agency because it's something you kind of come back to over and over again, the participation and the shared power with
Mm-hmm.
folks, which I
Mm-hmm.
think is sort of the way that you're really upending that notion in pure journalism. That folks get to have a say in what their story is, that they even get to tell their own story in the process in longer form pieces, and that over and over again becomes a thing that is not only necessary in what is to your thinking, I think mine as well, in
Mm-hmm.
a, a good project, but also is what creates the healing. And
Right.
I think it resonated for me for a couple of reasons, including the fact that power is one of the four tenets of the
Oh,
TFOP,
right. Yes.
often power, purpose, and possibility. But
Right.
also, the way that we found each other is that we have a lot of folks in common through alternate routes. And alternate routes has these principles that were created by our Resources for Social Change. It was kind of a think tank group of our elders. And those include these these tenets, and one of them is shared power for, the tenets for working in community, principles for
Yeah.
working. And shared power being one of those tenets. So I just was really jamming on all of the different ways. I'm curious, like, I think you talked about some of the ways that in your approach with the folks that you wanted to work with, you sort of established that from the get-go. So, but can you talk about like a little bit how you establish a sense of sort of unpacking power and making that a sort of more visible part of the work?
Yeah, I love that question. Unpack, like, how do you unpack power and make it visible? So, I think what we did from the beginning, I'll talk about how we did that with survivors, and then later I'll talk about how we did that with law enforcement, which we also had to do it with, and advocates,
Mhm.
um, which was pretty much the same, I guess, now that I think about it, of course. Um, so one way we unpacked power is that we named it. Like we invited people together. We talked about traditional roles of journalists and how we wanted to expand that. So we said very clearly to the survivors when we got together, we understand that most journalism has been we interview you, we go away, we do something, and you never hear from us again. Or we have an idea for a project and then we go find people who fit into that project. So we kind of name some traditional roles. And I'm not saying any of those are bad. I'm just saying that some traditional ways journalists do their story development. And we said we'd like to expand our role and share power in naming and framing the issues and solutions by inviting you into our editorial process. And we're going to start by just finding out what your goals are. So one practice we did was we found out with everybody who we involved, what are your goals for being involved? What would you like to get out of this? And we asked people what would help you feel safe and motivated to keep meeting with us, which was really important with survivors because every time they meet with us, there's a small triggering, right? Because we're talking about the worst moment in their life. So one thing is to elicit their goals and intentionally bring those goals into shaping the project goals. So we found out their goals, we shared our goals, and then we came up with some shared goals together that became the project goals. So one thing is that's a very clear example in sharing power and having people see that what they have said and what they want, not all of it, but some of it goes into the shaping of the project. So that's one thing. Another thing is kind of co-creating the rules of the road or the guidelines. So we would set community agreements. We don't just show up in a room and do what we think needs to be done. We kind of asked early on, we're planning on meeting with you. We didn't plan to meet as often as we did, but we did plan to meet a few times, right? And so we asked, like, what are some guidelines you want to set, or some agreements, or some rules, house rules, that we can all abide by, that we all know are the rules and we could all abide by. And that's where people can talk about like Chatham House rules, anonymity, confidentiality, or some things like using I statements or, start with believing. I mean, there's just so many things that can come up about what's going to help people feel like they have some say in how this whole thing is going to go. So that's a shared power in process. Um, and then another thing I think we did is at the very beginning and the very end of every time we met with them, we do some version of a check-in, check-out, some kind of icebreaker or warm up or interactive activity so that people could ground and settle and say like what they're feeling. They could leave things at the door. They can bring them in if they want. Like they could be their full selves, and ask for whatever they needed that day. Sometimes people are feeling quiet, so they're just going to be hanging out, but they're not going to talk. And one, it was incredibly liberating for them to say, I want to be here, but I'm not feeling well. So I'm not going to talk, but I'm with you, or they could say, I'm really anxious. So I'm going to be real freaky for a while. But whatever anyone's nervous system needs to calm by stating, what they're feeling, checking in, having it be a shared, like, okay, we're with you, we're all supporting you. And then a checkout at the end, like, how do we leave this work that we've done here, which was usually quite intense, and transition back out. And they asked us, the survivor cohort, we called them, to create that was one of the things they asked for. Like, we need a checkout. So we need some aspirational quotes or meditative exercises or activities where we could kind of process and leave here the work we've done and transition back out. So that's another way of sharing power. And we did similar things when we started involving law enforcement and advocates. We involved them in goal setting, we involved them in agreements, community agreements, goal guidelines. And we always did like check out activities to make sure like we understood what they were feeling and thinking, or they had an opportunity. And often those were anonymous so that they could feel like they could be candid and honest to say what they were feeling and ask for what they want.
Imagine it might have been even more surprising to the law enforcement officers that they were being involved in that part of the process.
I have to say, it was really working with the law enforcement that was was a transformational piece for me. I have some biases around law enforcement. I wasn't imagining would involve them. But, in going through that goal setting with the survivors, one of their top goals was to make sure what they experienced didn't happen to other people in the reporting process. Um, to have their painful experiences make a difference for future survivors, and essentially to change law enforcement protocols. And I just knew that that was not going to happen without involving the people who had the levers on making that change. Like, we needed to involve law enforcement. But this was kind of during the defund the police movement, the ongoing abolition movement, a lot of law enforcement, they kind of have I feel like they often have a circle the wagons mentality. It's probably earned, especially with media and journalists. There's a tension, right? Journalists are like, we're watchdogs. We're going to report on you and kind of shame you with data. And so I can understand why law enforcement's like, we're going to have you talk to our public information officer, who's trained to, like, keep you away from us. So it was a really big deal to reach out to them and again be very transparent in the email invitation and in the first meeting. Like, we understand that the relationship between journalists and law enforcement is fraught. We understand this is a movement that is particularly dicey for law enforcement to talk with us about their reporting processes and protocols. And we believe that we all share a desire to make the legal reporting process, um, uh, improve that for everybody. And what we needed to do is figure out where our common ground was. And once we figured that out, Shannon, I mean, I was amazed at how much time law enforcement gave us. They showed up consistently. They did extra work. They did a lot of research to make sure our reporting was technically correct because there's so much technical, the law is very technical. The codes are very technical. Um, and um, and because of that, and here's the punchline, right? Because we involved law enforcement, almost all of the recommendations that the survivors came up with in this process were taken up, and those changes actually happened because we were able to create a way. We didn't bring survivors and law enforcement together. But what we were able to do is play law enforcement clips from survivors And we were able to do some world building exercises and other kinds of planning and visioning exercises where people, the survivors at the center of the issue, could really articulate what they experienced and ideas for change. And, law enforcement, they're just, like most institutions, just trying to keep their doors open and to keep things going. They don't have this reflection time. And it's really not their job to sit back and critique their systems and make changes. We would hope that they do that, but
Yeah.
I think in general, most institutions that they don't, that's not what they're doing, right? They're just moving forward, providing services. So they were able to look at this as a real benefit and and a way do they were able to see the public service in public service journalism, that our journalists had spent the time gathering all of this information and just said, here are ideas. And they were able to take those and use them because they trusted us. We had built relationships of trust. They understood where that information was coming from and they respected the process.
Yeah.
So, in other words, they felt cared for and they saw the care and intention that we had put into the whole process. And that care built the trust. And the amount of care we showed to them, they reciprocated, which is
Yeah.
not something you hear from law enforcement.
Right. Yeah. I thought there were two really interesting moments where you kind of were very open and a little bit risky about sort of laying out a couple of things about either you flat out ignored something you were asked or told to do.
Yeah.
Um, One being about when the pandemic was descending and you were asked to sort of like put the project on a hold or a hiatus, and you were like, absolutely not. I cannot. These folks, the survivors had already gone through the trauma of first the assault and then the system consistently putting them on hold. You
Right.
know, one of the things you were trying to help ameliorate. And so you sort of went forward on your own and like made these meetings happen. So I thought that was really interesting, the way that you sort of visibilized that part of the project and were vulnerable about the fact that you had done that
Yeah.
with that. And then this other really interesting moment of what you're talking about in terms of both the survivors and the law enforcement had asked to be put in a room together with each other, and with each having their own agendas about that. And you were like, no. I thought that was really interesting, the way you sort of like set the stakes for that being a thing that, because of the deep relationships you had built with both folks, you were like,
Right.
not bringing this like high noon scene up. I'm not going to do that. But
Yeah.
what you said in terms of like, I'm going to serve as a proxy for this.
Right. Right. I think one of the things that I think is interesting in journalism is that they do have a code of conduct that says do no harm.
Mhm.
And one of the other ideas that I think has been circling in journalism is an ethic of care. And I think that there's a way in which, and it's going to be different from different individuals, but for me, certainly I could see harm coming from that situation. So, how could I approach it with care to basically meet the request, but in a way that I thought would minimize harm? So, being a proxy was that. The other tricky one that I talk about in the guide is when um, we had found out from working with survivors that one of the things that was most harmful to them was something called pretext phone calls. And they're not always phone calls, they're often text messages or social messages. But it's basically a way in which the survivor reaches out to the perpetrator and engages them in a conversation in which the perpetrator admits to forcing, a sexual act. It is the one of the main ways that law enforcement has for gathering evidence. And because it's so harmful, that we decided to put this in a guide so that survivors know what they're getting into. And the law enforcement asked us to remove it. And so I was in this situation where, wait, people at the center of the issue want and need this information so they're not harmed. And law enforcement is asking for it to be removed. That's a red flag. But what law enforcement said is just what I said to you earlier, which is this, if our goal is to, basically combat rape culture and basically bring justice to the survivors by bringing forward a case against perpetrators. We need evidence. This is a very good way to get evidence. If you put this in the guide, you are basically broadcasting how we do this.
Mm.
And so we chose to take it out. So again, it was like having to look at what is the goal, what is the shared goal of all of the stakeholders we're engaging, from survivors to advocates to doctors to, you know, police officers. Our shared goal is to, help survivors get justice and healing and improve the legal reporting process. That ask helped met that goal, even though it meant not giving future survivors, information to help understand. And we did actually nuance it a bit more. We did write about it and say a little bit about it, but we didn't give the full information. That was tricky.
Yeah, I'm sure. So now it's out there, this big, beautiful thing you've been working on for a long time. How are you hoping it's going to be used? What's the plan for mixing it up?
I have to tell you, I love your questions. um, so um, it has been published by the Center for Cooperative Media. They're wonderful partners, and edited by Anjali Shah, who was amazing. And I had a whole review team. And all of those people are involved in helping get this out into the world, both to mostly into news conversations and journalism, um, into the journalism field. So that's how we're getting it out there. We're, on our socials, sending it out, getting it out through newsletters, all that kind of thing. How I hope it is used. And I am actually sharing it back. I've shared it back with law enforcement, so the people involved can share it with their networks. Same with Rape Crisis Center. I may try and do some work through the network here in California to start, of sexual assault response teams. I worked with a sexual assault response team. They were the group we partnered with to kind of co-create this. That included the law enforcement, the rape crisis counselors and advocates, the healthcare providers. One idea I have, Shannon, is to work with both, the Association of Law Enforcement Officers and the Association of Sexual Assault Response Teams and the Association of Rape Crisis Centers to share it out, and mostly to help figure out how we can continue to have conversations and work collaboratively with public media to keep doing this reporting and this storytelling and this bridge building and healing. I think the main way I hope it is used is by all sorts of journalists, of which there are many and more every day, who are really interested in looking at their own practice, the training that they have, their own practice, and then where they'd like to go, and how might some of these concepts and practices support them in going in that direction. To make it more concrete and circle back to what we said earlier, there's tons of journalists who really are passionate about making change in the world and have big hearts and care tremendously. They happen to have had a training and are in a newsroom culture that often works against putting themselves in the story or showing that care more directly or even having formal opportunities to understand how some practices that they've been taught might disallow them from getting to their goals around building trust. So I hope that they could read this and look at the actual practices that are offered and see which ones might work for them, and then test them out, use them. And if they work, keep going, do more. I hope it supports building the field. Journalism is unraveling. It's critical for for democracy and for community resilience. And I want to support journalists, and I want more people to understand the critical role they play, and for everyone to be able to work well together.
So usually about this time in our conversation, there's a few different things that happen. So I'm going to let you choose, as would be what you would do in your practice.
You're so good.
As we were talking about, there's four tenets of the Teapot Project: passion,
Yes.
possibility, and power. Sometimes I ask people to tell me a story about one of those tenets that like resonates with them from your life. Sometimes I ask people if they would like to tell me a story based on a random generator of numbers from that age of their life. Or door number three,
I love
you
it.
can tell me what excites you about the Teapot Project and what resonates with you about it, what you think I should be doing, or anything about that work that you're like jamming on.
Those are juicy doors.
No.
I'm such a both and ice cream and cake and ice cream on top. I think I'm going to go for the random generator because it's just such a beautiful idea and nothing I've ever done.
Okay. Tell me when to stop.
What do you mean?
You got to tell me when it's spinning. So when
Oh,
you
stop. 'Didn't-
78, you have to tell me a story about yourself at the age of 78.
Oh my gosh.
So it's a future manifesting story.
At 78, I walked into this room and I immediately could feel that the room and the environment was created with such care. I could tell by the lighting, the comfy chairs, the candles, the flowers, that this was an experience that was created with so much intention, that I felt like I belonged, I felt welcomed, I felt curious and ready to open up to whatever the experience was going to be. And as I walked into the room, there was someone who greeted me and welcomed me. They directed me to some food. I went over and got some food, and there was a couple of people there that I bumped into from countries I'd never been to. Some not countries not from the US, but some just like neighborhoods or places. I mean, basically, I ran into people who I otherwise would not have had the opportunity to get to know. Um, and then we all sat down together, and the facilitator welcomed us and led us in one of the most beautiful conversations where I was able to really be present and open and meet all of these people who are completely different from me. And we realized that we had so much in common, and we generated so much goodwill and faith in humanity and in our shared humanity. And we decided together on a project that we were going to work on. And then we got to work. And I knew in that moment that what changes the world is people crossing divides and finding common cause, often over a shared meal in a cool space. And I knew that we were going to achieve our goals, even though they were really far outside of what I thought was possible. And I was heartened once again on how over and over it's just small groups of people coming together to work together to make the changes we want and need in our world.
I love how you told that story. I love how you told it like it's already happened and you're just seeing it, from that perspective. Good job, you. Are you sure you're not a storyteller? Well, you are.
You can tell it's my aspiration. It is my aspiration. So in a way, you got some of my purpose and power and passion in that story. It was a twofer.
Nice. Um, so, oh gosh, I seem to be having a little bit of an internet lag right here at the end. Are you there?
I am here. Yeah.
Okay,
I'm,
cool. So I'm gonna try and share screen because I want folks to see the beautiful front of this guide that you have created.
oh, thank
Um,
you.
it's can I do that? Yes, I can. Yes, it's a stunning visual. So folks, this is the Taking Care guide that we've been talking about today with Jessica Maria Ross, a guide for participatory and trauma-informed journalism. Jessica, how can folks find this?
Oh, they can go on I can send them a link. That's the best way. I mean, it's, it's funny. I should have that right at the top. I have a link I can send you. It's at the Center for Cooperative Media, and there is a downloadable link. And it's just out. So this is a good nudge to figure out a quick way for people to get it. I'll send you the link so that people can look at it in your show notes. And and it's also on my website, which is jessicamariaross.com.
I'll include that as I send out the link to this conversation as well. It's been such a pleasure to get to know you better and let me know how I continue to support your work. And thanks everybody for watching today or watching later on down the line. And look forward to continuing our conversation. Have a great rest of your day. Take care.
Thank you.